I learned something about betrayal the night my own son tried to take the company I built with my bare hands. It happened on Thanksgiving, the kind of cold November evening where the air outside smells like wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the house is warm with the scent of roasted turkey, butter, and cinnamon. My name is Michael Carter, and for 30 years I built Carter Logistics from nothing more than a used pickup truck and a stubborn promise to never quit. When I started that company, I was 24 years old, hauling freight across Texas highways at 2 in the morning with a thermos of black coffee and just enough gas money to get to the next job. Back then the business was just me, a truck that rattled past 60 miles per hour, and a notebook full of delivery routes scribbled in pencil. Over the years that little operation turned into something real. 27 trucks on the road, 2 warehouses, contracts that stretched from Dallas to Denver. I didn't inherit it, and nobody handed it to me. I built it mile by mile, load by load, through long winters and hotter summers than most people would tolerate. By the time I turned 56, Carter Logistics was worth more than I ever imagined when I was that young man gripping a steering wheel at midnight. And I thought, maybe foolishly, that everything I built would one day belong to my family. My wife Laura had been there since the early years. She used to sit in the passenger seat of that old truck on weekends when we were too broke to afford a babysitter, holding maps while I drove through rainstorms and construction zones. And our son Daniel grew up around the business. When he was a kid he used to run around the warehouse wearing a tiny reflective vest, pretending to direct trucks like he was the boss of the whole place. Back then I believed the company would become his one day, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. But people change. Success has a way of reshaping ambition, and ambition sometimes forgets where it came from. Over the past few years Daniel started talking less about hard work and more about expansion, investors, strategy. Words that sound impressive when you say them over a glass of expensive bourbon but don't mean much when you're the guy who once slept in a truck stop parking lot just to deliver a load on time. I noticed the shift, but I told myself it was just the difference between generations. That night the house was full. Family crowded around the long oak dining table, plates stacked with turkey and sweet potatoes, the television in the living room murmuring with a football game nobody was really watching. Laughter filled the room the way it always does on Thanksgiving, the kind of comfortable noise that makes you think everything in life is exactly where it should be. Then Daniel stood up with a glass of wine in his hand and cleared his throat like a man about to make a toast. I remember thinking he was about to thank everyone for coming. Instead he smiled across the table at Laura, then looked straight at me and said something that made the entire room erupt in applause. "Mom transferred the company to me this morning," he said proudly. "Carter Logistics is officially mine now." The table exploded with cheers and congratulations. Someone clapped Daniel on the back. Laura beamed like she had just given our son the greatest gift a mother could give. And me? I didn't shout. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I simply sat there, holding a glass of bourbon, watching my family celebrate a victory they didn't understand. Because the one thing Daniel didn't know that night was this. The company he thought he owned wasn't actually the company I built. The applause kept rolling around the table like a wave that refused to settle, forks paused in midair, wine glasses lifted, relatives leaning across the table to congratulate Daniel like he had just climbed the top of some mountain. My brother-in-law slapped him on the shoulder and said that it was about time the company passed to the next generation. My sister nodded proudly like she had watched the whole thing coming for years. Laura sat at the end of the table with that calm, satisfied smile that told everyone she believed she had done something generous, something wise. I let them celebrate. I let the moment breathe. 30 years of building something from the ground up teaches you patience, and patience is a quiet kind of power. I lifted the bourbon glass slowly, letting the ice shift and clink against the crystal. Nobody noticed me yet. They were too busy shaking Daniel's hand. The funny thing about success is that people love the victory speech, but they rarely understand the foundation under the building. Carter Logistics did not appear overnight. It was built on thousands of miles of highway and more early mornings than I can count. There were winters when I drove through snowstorms across Colorado with chains on the tires and coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. There were summers in Texas when the heat rose off the asphalt like a mirage, and the truck cab felt like an oven set above 90 degrees. Every contract came from showing up when other companies did not. Every warehouse came from reinvesting profits when everyone else spent them. That was the difference between a business that survives and a business that disappears. Daniel knew the polished version of the story. He knew the version told at company Christmas parties and award dinners, the one where people talk about growth charts and expansion strategies. What he did not know were the quiet decisions that happen when nobody is watching, the legal structures, the safeguards, the small lines and documents that determine who actually holds the keys to the kingdom. A company is not just trucks and buildings and bank accounts. It is structure. It is control. It is ownership written in places most people never think to look. I watched Daniel accept congratulations from cousins and neighbors who had never spent a single hour inside the warehouse loading freight. His confidence filled the room. He believed the moment belonged to him. Laura poured more wine and leaned back in her chair with that proud expression mothers sometimes wear when they think their plan worked perfectly. I realized something then. Neither of them had looked at me yet. Not once since the announcement. Not one person at that table asked whether I agreed with what had just happened. They all assumed the transfer was real, that the man who built the company had simply stepped aside. I set my glass down on the table with a soft click and finally spoke, my voice calm and steady. I asked a simple question, the kind of question that sounds ordinary until you understand what it means. I looked directly at Daniel and said, "Did your lawyer explain the ownership structure before you celebrated tonight?" The room grew quieter for the first time since the announcement, and Daniel frowned like he was trying to understand why that question mattered. Daniel stared at me across the Thanksgiving table like he had just heard a question in a language he did not understand. The room had gone quieter now, not silent, but the kind of quiet that happens when a conversation suddenly shifts direction. My brother-in-law slowly lowered his fork. Someone set down a glass. Even the television in the other room seemed louder now as a football announcer echoed faintly down the hallway. Daniel let out a small laugh, the kind people use when they assume someone is joking. He said that of course the lawyer explained everything and that the paperwork was official. Laura nodded beside him with confidence that looked carefully rehearsed. She said that the documents were signed that morning and that the company had finally been transferred the way it should have been years ago. I listened without interrupting. The bourbon in my glass had melted enough that the ice had turned to a soft clink instead of a sharp one. I had heard that tone before in business meetings, the tone people use when they believe the outcome has already been decided. Daniel leaned forward slightly and rested his elbows on the table like the man of the hour. He said that the lawyer assured them everything was legal and clean and that Carter Logistics now belonged to him. A few relatives nodded again like they were watching the official passing of the torch. I noticed something then. Daniel kept using the word company, but he never said the name of the holding structure. That was not his fault. Most people never think about the difference between a business and the structure that controls it. When I started Carter Logistics all those years ago, it was simple. One truck. One account. One name on the registration. But as the years passed and the company grew into something larger, the decisions became more complicated. Growth attracts risk. Success attracts people who believe they deserve a piece of what you built. That is why real companies eventually stop being simple. They become layers of protection. Layers of ownership. Layers of control that sit quietly in the background where most people never look. I leaned back in my chair and studied Daniel's face for a moment. He looked proud, confident, even a little impatient that I had interrupted the celebration. Laura reached for her wine glass and said that there was no need to question the process because the lawyer handled everything properly. Her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who believed the story was already finished. That was when I asked my second question, still calm, still quiet, but more precise this time. I asked Daniel if the lawyer had explained the difference between Carter Logistics, the operating company, and Carter Holdings, the parent structure that actually owned the assets. Daniel blinked once like someone trying to remember a detail he had not expected to matter. His smile faded slightly. Around the table a few people shifted in their chairs, sensing that the conversation had stepped onto unfamiliar ground. Daniel said that the paperwork transferred the company, and that was all that mattered. I nodded slowly and folded my hands on the table. Then I said something that made the entire room feel smaller. I said that transferring the operating company does not transfer what it does not own. I could see the confidence draining from Daniel's face the same way ice melts in a warm glass of bourbon. It did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, the way realization often arrives when a person begins to understand that the story they believed was incomplete. Around the table, people looked from Daniel to me and back again, like spectators trying to figure out whether the game they had been cheering was suddenly playing by different rules. Laura set her wine glass down a little harder than before, the stem tapping against the wood of the table. She asked what I meant, her voice steady but carrying the edge of someone who did not enjoy surprises. I did not rush my answer. 30 years in business teaches you that timing matters almost as much as truth. I folded my hands on the table and looked at Daniel the same way I used to look at him when he was younger and trying to understand how something worked. I explained that Carter Logistics, the company he believed had been transferred to him that morning, was only the operating arm of the business. It handled the trucks, the drivers, the dispatch office, the daily movement of freight across highways and distribution routes. It was the name painted on the doors of the trailers and printed on the contracts customers signed. But an operating company is not always the heart of a business. Sometimes it is only the front door. Daniel blinked again, slower this time, like the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to shift in his mind. I continued calmly, because anger was unnecessary when the truth could do the work for me. I explained that 5 years earlier, when Carter Logistics crossed the threshold from a successful company into something larger, I made a decision that most founders eventually make. I restructured the ownership. Not because I planned to give the company away, and not because I expected a moment like this, but because any business worth millions of dollars needs protection from risk, lawsuits, taxes, and the unpredictable storms that come with growth. That was when Carter Holdings was created. The trucks, the warehouses, the land beneath those warehouses, the banking relationships, the long-term contracts with major clients, all of it moved into the holding structure. Carter Logistics continued to operate exactly the same way from the outside, but inside the legal framework everything changed. The operating company leased its trucks from the holding company. It leased the warehouse buildings. It even licensed the name. Daniel's expression tightened as he listened, and I could see the calculations starting behind his eyes. Someone at the table quietly asked what that meant. I turned my attention back to Daniel and answered the question without raising my voice. I said it meant that owning the operating company does not mean owning the business. The trucks do not belong to it. The buildings do not belong to it. The contracts do not belong to it. Those assets belong to the holding company. Laura leaned forward now, her earlier certainty fading into something sharper, something more cautious. Daniel reached for his phone like a man who suddenly realized he might need a second opinion. And that was when the room truly understood that the celebration might have started too soon. Daniel did not speak for several seconds. He stared at his phone like it had suddenly become the most important object in the room. The celebration that had filled the dining room only minutes earlier was now hanging in the air like a balloon that had slowly lost its air. My brother-in-law leaned back in his chair, no longer smiling. A fork scraped lightly against the plate somewhere down the table, and then even that sound stopped. Laura watched Daniel carefully, the way someone watches a chessboard after realizing the next move might not be what they expected. Daniel unlocked his phone and stepped away from the table, moving a few feet toward the hallway where the signal was stronger. I could hear the faint dialing tone in the quiet room. Nobody spoke. Even the relatives who had been cheering the loudest now looked uncertain, as if they had suddenly realized they might not fully understand the situation they had been celebrating. Daniel lifted the phone to his ear and waited. When the lawyer answered, his voice was confident at first. He explained that we were having dinner, and that a question had come up about the ownership structure. At that point his eyes flicked toward me, the same way someone glances at a storm cloud they are beginning to notice on the horizon. He repeated my question almost word for word. Had the lawyer explained the relationship between the operating company and Carter Holdings? The answer came through the speaker softly, but in a quiet room you do not need to hear every word to understand what is being said. Daniel's posture changed first. His shoulders tightened slightly. His smile vanished completely. A moment later he asked another question, this one slower, more careful. If he owned the operating company, then what exactly did that give him control over? The lawyer spoke again. This time Daniel did not interrupt. He simply listened. Around the table people exchanged small glances. Laura's expression hardened, not with anger, but with the concentration of someone who is starting to reconsider an assumption. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of bourbon while Daniel continued listening. Business structures are not dramatic things. They do not explode or collapse in a single moment. They reveal themselves quietly, line by line, clause by clause, until the person hearing them understands the difference between appearance and reality. Daniel lowered the phone slightly and asked one final question that everyone in the room could hear clearly. He asked whether Carter Logistics owned the trucks, the warehouses, and the major freight contracts. The answer came quickly this time. No. Those assets belong to Carter Holdings. The operating company leased them. Daniel slowly pulled the phone away from his ear and ended the call. When he turned back toward the table, the confidence he had carried into the room earlier that evening was gone. Not replaced by anger, not replaced by panic, but replaced by something far quieter. Understanding. Laura looked at him immediately and asked what the lawyer said. Daniel took a breath, glanced toward me, and then spoke the sentence that changed the mood of the entire room. He said that the company he believed had been transferred to him did not actually own the business. Laura did not react immediately after Daniel spoke. For a few seconds she simply looked at him as if she expected the rest of the sentence to change the meaning of the first half. But it did not. Daniel stood there beside the table with his phone still in his hand, and the quiet in the room deepened in a way that made every small movement noticeable. Someone shifted in their chair. The football announcer on the television raised his voice about a touchdown none of us were watching. Laura leaned forward slowly and asked Daniel to repeat what the lawyer said. Daniel cleared his throat and chose his words carefully, the same way someone explains a mistake they did not realize they were making. He said the operating company had been transferred exactly as the paperwork described. That part was correct. Carter Logistics, the entity that handled payroll, dispatch schedules, and day-to-day freight operations, now listed him as the owner. But the lawyer had also explained something else. Carter Logistics did not actually own the trucks. It did not own the warehouses outside Dallas and Tulsa. It did not own the distribution contracts with the two national retailers that accounted for nearly half the company revenue. Those assets belonged to Carter Holdings, the parent structure that leased them back to the operating company. Laura frowned, the first sign that the ground under her certainty had started to shift. She asked Daniel what that meant in practical terms. Daniel hesitated before answering, not because he did not understand anymore, but because he now understood too well. He said it meant that Carter Logistics was responsible for managing the business operations, but the real value of the company sat somewhere else entirely. The trucks that crossed the highways every day belonged to Carter Holdings. The buildings where the freight was stored belonged to Carter Holdings. Even the long-term service contracts were legally tied to the holding company rather than the operating entity. In other words, the company Daniel believed he had inherited did not actually control the foundation of the business. Around the table the realization moved from one person to another like a slow ripple across water. My brother-in-law leaned back farther in his chair, folding his arms as he processed the information. One of Laura's cousins quietly set down his wine glass and stared at the tablecloth, as if rereading a contract he had never seen before. Laura looked at me then, her expression no longer proud, no longer certain, but searching. She asked why the structure had never been explained to her. I answered honestly because there was no reason not to. I said the structure had never been hidden. It had simply never been discussed at family dinners because most people do not ask about legal frameworks when a company is running smoothly. 5 years earlier, when the business expanded into 3 states, the accountants and attorneys recommended the change to protect the assets and separate operational risk from ownership. That is standard practice in companies that grow past a certain size. Daniel slowly returned to his chair and placed the phone beside his plate. The earlier celebration felt distant now, like a memory from another evening. Laura looked from him to me and asked the question that had been building in the room since the moment Daniel ended the call. She asked who actually owned Carter Holdings. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I picked up my glass again, let the ice settle, and then looked directly at her and Daniel before speaking. The question hung in the air like the final card in a game everyone suddenly realized had not ended yet. Laura's eyes stayed fixed on me across the table, searching for an answer that would restore the certainty she had carried only minutes earlier. Daniel did not speak. He already understood enough to know that the next words mattered more than everything that had happened so far that evening. I let the silence sit for a moment, not out of cruelty, but because silence has a way of helping people hear the truth. When it finally arrives, I lifted my glass slightly, the eyes shifting with a quiet sound, and then I answered the question directly. Carter Holdings belongs to me. The words were simple, calm, and completely ordinary, yet the effect on the room was immediate. Laura leaned back slightly in her chair as if the distance might help her process what she had just heard. Daniel looked down at the table for a second before lifting his eyes again, this time without the confidence he had walked in with earlier that night. No one spoke for several seconds. My brother-in-law slowly uncrossed his arms, and one of the cousins quietly cleared his throat. It was not anger that filled the room. It was realization. The kind that arrives when a person finally sees the structure behind something they thought they understood. I explained it the same way I would explain a business decision during a board meeting, steady and clear. 5 years earlier, when the company expanded into multiple states and the revenue crossed a level where legal risk becomes a serious concern, the accountants and attorneys advised restructuring the ownership. The operating company continued to run the day-to-day logistics operations, but the assets were moved into Carter Holdings. That structure protected the trucks, the warehouses, and the contracts from operational liability. It also ensured that the person controlling the holding company controlled the future of the entire business. Daniel nodded slowly, almost to himself, as if replaying the conversation with the lawyer in his mind and realizing that every piece now fit together. Laura, however, still held on to the question that had been driving her decisions. She asked why I had never mentioned any of this to her or to Daniel. Her tone was no longer proud, no longer certain, but it carried something else now, something closer to frustration. I answered honestly again. I said that the structure had never been hidden. The company accountants reviewed it every year. The board documents included it. The legal filings listed it clearly. But conversations about ownership frameworks rarely come up during family dinners or holiday gatherings. People talk about growth, about expansion, about future plans, but very few people ask about the legal architecture underneath the business. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair and looked around the table, as if noticing the room again for the first time since the announcement earlier that evening. The excitement that had filled the house when he made his toast was gone now, replaced by something quieter and far more thoughtful. Laura folded her hands together and asked one final question, her voice careful and deliberate. She asked whether Carter Logistics could continue operating if Carter Holdings decided to change the terms of the leases and contracts. I set the glass down gently and looked directly at her before answering. I said that Carter Logistics operates because Carter Holdings allows it to operate, and the person who decides those terms is the owner of Carter Holdings. The room stayed quiet after I explained how the structure worked, the kind of quiet that settles over people when they realize the rules of the situation were never what they assumed. Laura sat very still across the table, her hands folded together now instead of holding her wine glass. Daniel stared at the wood grain of the dining table for a moment, thinking, calculating, replaying every step that had led to this dinner. A few relatives shifted in their seats, unsure whether the conversation was finished or just beginning. I had seen that look many times before in business meetings when investors realized the deal on the table was not quite the deal they believed they were signing. It was not anger. It was recognition. Daniel finally lifted his head and looked at me with a seriousness that had not been there earlier that evening. He asked the question slowly, choosing every word carefully, as if each word carried weight. He asked whether the transfer Laura arranged meant anything at all if Carter Holdings still controlled the assets. I nodded once because the honest answer mattered more than comfort. I explained that the transfer did mean something. It meant he now owned the operating company. He could manage the dispatch office, oversee the drivers, approve schedules, and run the day-to-day logistics work that kept freight moving across highways every morning before sunrise. But ownership of operations is not the same thing as ownership of the business itself. The trucks, the warehouses, and the contracts are the backbone of a logistics company. Without those assets, the operating company is simply a management layer coordinating resources it does not own. Daniel absorbed that quietly. Laura leaned forward again, her voice lower now, almost cautious. She asked whether the leases and contracts could simply continue the way they always had, as if nothing had changed. I told her they could continue exactly as they were if the holding company allowed it. That was the entire purpose of the structure. It separated control of the assets from the daily management of operations. The person who owned the holding company determined the terms under which those assets were used. Around the table, the relatives listened with the same attention people give to a story that suddenly matters more than they expected. Daniel rested his hands on the table and asked another question. This one was different. It was not about ownership documents or legal structures. It was about intention. He asked whether I had planned this outcome all along. I shook my head slowly. I told him the structure was not created to trap anyone or to embarrass anyone at a holiday dinner. It was created because businesses that reach a certain size require protection and clarity of control. Any responsible founder eventually builds that protection into the company. What happened tonight was simply the moment when that structure became visible. Daniel exhaled quietly and leaned back in his chair again. Laura watched both of us carefully, the certainty she had earlier replaced by careful awareness that every word now carried real consequences. Outside the windows the evening had grown darker, the reflection of the dining room lights faint against the glass. The house was still warm with the smell of Thanksgiving dinner, but the mood around the table had changed completely. Finally Laura asked the question that had clearly been forming in her mind since the moment Daniel ended the call with the lawyer. She asked whether Carter Holdings would continue supporting Carter Logistics under the same terms it always had. I looked at her and then at Daniel before answering, because the truth in business is rarely complicated. It is simply direct. I said that decision depends on whether the people running Carter Logistics understand who actually built the foundation they are standing on. Laura did not answer immediately after I said that. She sat there looking at the table like she was rereading the last 10 minutes of conversation in her mind, searching for the moment where things had shifted away from the outcome she expected. Around us the room felt different. Now. The food was still on the plates, the turkey carved and half finished, the sweet potatoes cooling beside bowls of cranberry sauce, but nobody seemed interested in eating anymore. The earlier celebration had faded into something quieter and more reflective. Daniel finally spoke again, but the confidence that had filled his voice earlier that night was gone. He asked me something that sounded less like a challenge and more like a genuine question. He asked why I had never explained the structure to him before tonight. I looked at him for a moment before answering, not because the answer was complicated, but because it was honest. I told him that building a business and understanding a business are not always the same thing. For years he had watched the company grow from the outside. He saw the trucks increase from a handful to nearly 30. He saw the warehouses expand, the contracts grow larger, the revenue climb year after year. But the deeper parts of a business are rarely visible to someone who has not taken the time to study them. Ownership structures, legal frameworks, financial protections, those are things most people ignore until the day they matter. Daniel nodded slowly, accepting that explanation in a way that told me he was beginning to see the difference. Laura, however, still had one more question resting behind her expression. She asked whether Carter Holdings intended to keep supporting the operating company at all. Her voice was steady, but careful now, as if she understood that the answer might shape everything that came next. I told her the truth again because there was no reason to pretend otherwise. Carter Holdings was created to protect the company, not to destroy it. The trucks would keep running. The warehouses would stay open. The drivers would keep delivering freight across the same highways they always had. Nothing about the operation needed to change. But there was one thing that did need to change, and everyone at the table understood it before I even said the words. Respect. A business built over 30 years does not survive because of paperwork alone. It survives because the people involved understand the value of the work that created it. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful now instead of proud. He said he understood what I meant. He admitted that earlier that evening he believed the announcement would mark the beginning of a new chapter where he controlled the future of the company. Now he realized the future depended on something else entirely. It depended on whether he was willing to learn the business from the foundation up rather than assuming ownership meant instant authority. I nodded once because that was the first thing he had said all night that sounded like a business decision instead of a celebration. Laura looked between the two of us, the earlier certainty gone completely. She asked quietly whether there was still a path forward for the family and the company together. I took one more sip of bourbon, letting the ice settle in the glass, and then answered with the same calm voice I had used all evening. I said that the path forward had always been there. The only difference now was that everyone in the room finally understood who had built the road. Daniel stayed quiet for a long moment after I spoke, the kind of silence that comes when a person realizes the direction of their life might be changing in ways they did not expect a few hours earlier. The relatives around the table had stopped pretending to eat entirely now. Plates sat untouched, glasses half full, the warm Thanksgiving dinner slowly cooling while everyone focused on the conversation that had taken over the room. Laura looked down at the table for a few seconds, then back at me. The confidence she carried earlier had been replaced by something more thoughtful, almost careful. She asked whether I had already decided what the future of the company would look like. I understood the real question behind her words. She wanted to know if the business would stay in the family, or if tonight had changed that possibility. I rested my hands on the table and answered slowly, the same way I had answered every other question that evening. I said that the future of the company had never been about paperwork alone. It had always been about responsibility. Carter Logistics had grown because every decision over the last 3 decades came from patience, discipline, and respect for the work itself. Trucks do not move freight because someone signs a document. They move freight because people show up before sunrise, check the routes, inspect the equipment, and deliver every load the way they promised they would. Daniel nodded slightly, listening in a way he had not earlier in the evening. I could see the difference in his expression now. The pride that had filled the room when he made the announcement had been replaced by something far more valuable. Curiosity. He asked what it would take to earn real control of the company someday. Not the operating title, not the announcement at a family dinner, but the responsibility that actually came with ownership. I told him the truth again because the answer had always been simple. I said that ownership is not given through celebration. It is built through understanding. If he wanted to lead the company one day, he would have to start the same way every person who helped build it had started. Learning the routes. Learning the driver schedules. Learning the contracts and the numbers behind them. Understanding why each truck on the road mattered and how every warehouse functioned. Laura listened quietly beside him, her earlier certainty replaced with a quiet acceptance that the story she imagined earlier that night was not the real one. Daniel finally leaned forward slightly and asked whether I would be willing to teach him. That question changed the room in a way none of the earlier announcements had. Because that was the first moment all evening that sounded like the beginning of something real. I looked at him and nodded once. I said that I had never built the company to keep it from my family. I built it to make sure that if someone in the family wanted to carry it forward, they would understand what it took to create it in the first place. The room relaxed slightly after that, the tension easing the way it does when people realize the conversation is no longer a conflict but a lesson. Outside the windows, the November night had settled fully around the house, quiet and dark. Inside, the smell of Thanksgiving dinner still filled the air. Daniel looked around the table one more time, then back at me, and said he understood something now that he had not understood before. Building something that lasts is very different from inheriting something that already exists. Daniel sat quietly after asking if I would teach him, and the look on his face reminded me of the boy who used to wander through the warehouse on Saturday mornings wearing a reflective vest. That was too big for him. For years he had seen the company from the outside, like most people see a building without ever asking how the foundation was poured. That night something had shifted. Not because of the legal structure or the phone call with the lawyer, but because he had finally seen how much of the story he had never understood. The relatives around the table had relaxed slightly now that the tension had faded, but they were still listening. When a conversation turns from celebration to reality, people tend to pay closer attention. Daniel asked another question, this one quieter than the ones before. He asked how long it had taken to truly understand the business when I started. I let out a small breath, not a laugh exactly, but something close to it. I told him the truth. I said I was still learning it. A company like Carter Logistics does not stop teaching you once it becomes successful. Every new contract brings new challenges. Every new state brings new regulations. Every year the numbers change and the market shifts. The only difference between someone who leads a company and someone who merely owns it is the willingness to keep learning long after the business becomes profitable. Daniel listened carefully, nodding slightly. Laura watched him in a way that suggested she was seeing him differently too. Earlier that evening she had believed she was helping him step into control of the company. Now she understood that leadership could not be handed across a dinner table like a Thanksgiving dish. It had to be earned in quieter places, early mornings at the dispatch office, long conversations with drivers who knew the highways better than any executive ever would. I told Daniel that if he truly wanted to understand the business, the first step would not happen in a conference room. It would happen at 5:30 in the morning when the first drivers arrived to check their routes. It would happen in the maintenance yard when a mechanic explains why a truck cannot simply be pushed another 1,000 miles without inspection. It would happen when a client calls because a shipment is late, and someone has to solve the problem before sunrise. That is where a logistics company actually lives. Daniel nodded again, slower this time, the way someone does when the picture finally becomes clear. He said he wanted to start there. Not in an office with a title, but in the places where the company actually worked. Laura looked at me and then back at Daniel, and for the first time that night she smiled in a different way. Not proud, not certain, but supportive. I could see she understood the difference now as well. Around us the room had settled into a quieter mood. The tension had disappeared completely, replaced by something that felt more like understanding. The relatives returned slowly to their plates, the conversation easing back toward ordinary family talk. Daniel looked across the table one more time and said something that mattered more than the earlier announcement ever had. He said that building a future for the company would mean respecting the past that created it. I nodded once and lifted my glass again, because that was the first moment all evening when the conversation sounded like the beginning of the next chapter rather than the end of the last one. The conversation slowly returned to the rhythm of a normal evening after that, but something important had changed beneath the surface. The tension that filled the room earlier had been replaced by a quiet awareness that the story everyone thought they were watching had turned into something else entirely. Plates were picked up again, glasses refilled, and small conversations began around the table, but Daniel remained thoughtful, sitting back in his chair as if he was still replaying every word that had been spoken. I recognized that look. It was the same expression I used to see on new managers during their first real lesson about responsibility. The moment when the idea of leadership stops being exciting and starts becoming real. Laura eventually reached for her wine glass again and took a slow sip, then looked across the table at me with a calmer expression than she had earlier that evening. She said that perhaps the announcement had come too soon. Not because she believed Daniel was incapable, but because she now understood that timing matters in business just as much as ambition. I nodded once because that was exactly right. Companies that last for decades are rarely built through sudden decisions. They grow through patience, careful planning, and respect for the work itself. Daniel finally spoke again, this time with a tone that carried none of the pride from earlier in the evening. He said that he realized something during the phone call with the lawyer. He realized that the real value of the company was not just the assets or the contracts. It was the knowledge behind them. The routes that had been refined over years. The relationships with drivers and clients. The decisions made during difficult seasons when growth slowed and mistakes had to be corrected. Those things cannot be transferred through paperwork. They have to be learned. I told him that realization was the most valuable thing he had said all night. Because every successful business eventually reaches a moment when the next generation has to decide whether they want the title or the responsibility that comes with it. Titles are easy to celebrate. Responsibility is what builds something that lasts. Daniel nodded again and said he understood that now. He even admitted that earlier that evening he had been excited by the idea of standing up at the table and announcing that the company belonged to him. In his mind it felt like stepping into the future. But the conversation that followed had shown him that the future of a company is not decided in one moment. It is shaped over years by the people willing to learn the details others overlook. Laura listened quietly beside him, and then said something that surprised several people at the table. She said that perhaps the best outcome of the evening was that the conversation had finally happened. Not the celebration she expected, but the conversation the company probably needed. Around us the dinner continued slowly, the sound of plates and quiet conversation returning to the room. The earlier tension had faded completely now, replaced by something steadier. Understanding. Daniel eventually stood and began helping clear the dishes from the table, something he had not done during the earlier excitement of his announcement. I watched him for a moment, and realized that in a strange way the evening had given him something far more valuable than the company he believed he was receiving. It had given him the first real lesson about what it actually takes to earn it. By the time the last plates were cleared and the kitchen lights softened into the quiet glow of evening, the house had returned to the calm rhythm of a normal Thanksgiving night. Relatives drifted into the living room to watch the end of the football game, the sound of commentators and distant cheering filling the background like a familiar soundtrack. The tension from earlier had faded, but the lesson from the evening remained sitting quietly in the room, understood by everyone who had heard the conversation unfold. Daniel came back to the table after helping carry dishes to the sink and sat down again across from me. The excitement that had once filled his voice had been replaced by something steadier. Respect. He rested his hands on the table and said he had been thinking about what I told him. For years he believed leadership meant standing at the front of the room making announcements, making decisions, holding the title that everyone recognized. But tonight he understood something different. Leadership starts much earlier than that. It starts when nobody is watching, when the work is quiet and the responsibility belongs to the person willing to carry it without applause. I nodded because that realization was worth more than any document that could have been signed earlier that day. I told him that when I bought my first truck at 24 years old I did not imagine a company with warehouses across several states. I only imagined surviving the next month, delivering the next shipment, paying the next bill. The business grew one decision at a time, not through sudden moments of ownership but through thousands of ordinary days where the work had to be done correctly. Daniel listened carefully, and then he asked when he should start learning the real side of the company. I told him the same thing I had said earlier. 5:30 in the morning. That is when the drivers arrive and the day actually begins. If he wanted to understand Carter logistics, he would start there. Daniel smiled slightly at that, not the confident smile he carried earlier that evening, but the kind that comes when someone realizes the road ahead will require effort. Laura stood nearby listening, and when she looked at Daniel this time her expression was calmer than before. She said she was proud of him, not for the announcement he made earlier, but for the way he was listening now. Around us the house had grown quiet except for the low sound of the television, and the occasional clink of dishes finishing in the sink. Thanksgiving had started with A celebration that no longer mattered. It ended with something far more important. Understanding. I picked up my glass one last time and looked across the table at Daniel. The company I built had always been more than trucks, warehouses, or contracts. It was the road that connected every mile of work that came before it. And now, for the first time that evening, I could see that Daniel understood exactly where that road began.